Shove it, squad. I don't know how this channel has been around for so long without me talking about Crimson, or if Taz would call him, Crimson. If you were watching TNA between 2010 and 2012, he was kind of a big deal. Or at least TNA wanted you to think he was. Crimson is most famed for TNA's attempt at turning him into the next Bill Goldberg by having him have a long undefeated streak. It didn't really work, but from the comments I read on here you'd think that Crimson was the second coming of Wes Briscoe. Let's find out if he was as bad as people say. And also I just wanted to give a quick shout out to the German guy over on Patreon who requested this video. If you want to make the Hawk talk, sign up on Patreon today. Before wrestling, Crimson was a member of the US Army and even toured in Iraq, so the guy was legit. Sometimes having real life experiences before getting into wrestling can help build personality. He's not exactly a goon, is he? His army experience would be used as part of his gimmick in later years. He decided he wanted to be a wrestler, and standing at 6'6", this seemed like a decent career choice. After a few years on the indies, he started wrestling tryout matches for TNA, and was hired at the end of 2010. He'd only wrestled 40 odd matches by the time TNA hired him, so although he was an army veteran, he certainly wasn't a wrestling veteran. Jeff Jarrett had been doing this stupid fake MMA challenge where he beat up children as a way to taunt Kurt Angle. He'd just beaten up Amazing Red, who had ginger short hair. Red announced that he was bringing in his little brother to smack Slapnuts one. With Red already being small and describing his brother as little, Jarrett was naturally not sweating it. The next week Red would reveal his little brother, and this is how Crimson debuted with TNA. For the first show he was just billed as Little Red because he also had ginger short hair. Whatever, it was kind of stupid. Crimson battered Jarrett in the ring and he bailed in fear, so a pretty good position for him to start in, fighting a TNA main eventer. But in an ongoing trend that battered Amazing Red for the rest of his TNA career, the storyline was randomly dropped before anything could happen. Crimson disappeared from TV for a month, and there was no follow-up to the storyline. Then at the start of 2011 he returned as Crimson, and he kept beating up members of the rip-off NWO faction Immortal. He kept saying that they were coming. Crimson then randomly killed Abyss by hitting him with his stick. Crimson was dressed in a smart suit. If you're wondering what this is all about, it's the aborted main event Mafia run from 2011. As most of the guys were available, and it was a rating success last time, it seemed like a decent call. But Nash and Booker chose to go to the WWE at the last minute, and fans of the main event Mafia would have to wait 2 more years for them to return. So because of this, the plans had to change, and what they did with Crimson instead was pointless and dumb. He did briefly address the situation with Amazing Red, where he said that although Red was his brother, he would always have his back, but he'd gotten a better offer. A better offer than your own flesh and blood? Hell, just a few months after this, Amazing Red was relegated and forced into doing another stupid gimmick as a masked wrestler called Sangriento, with cheese strings glued to his mask. Then he left TNA. Don't you think he could have used your help, Crimson? Crimson's first big TNA storyline was a bit of a letdown, really. He kept saying they were coming and talking in riddles. Kurt Angle soon joined him in speaking in tongues. This was during the horrible Immortal faction and nobody had any idea what was going on. How could they be coming when there was already a faction with 50 guys in it? So as previously mentioned, they had to bail on the main event Mafia idea. So the story had to change. And instead, it just turned out that they was Fortune turning on Immortal. Fortune were kind of a faction inside of the Immortal faction, made up of TNA originals. Needless to say, this had absolutely nothing to do with Crimson, so why he had this information I have no idea. Crimson went his own way anyway and it had nothing to do with it. He was soon picking up wins over Abyss and Samoa Joe. It was good to see TNA trying to get a guy over with some wins. The issue was that at this point both Abyss and Samoa Joe were complete losers who had been destroyed by some terrible booking over the last few years. Wins over them were rendered meaningless. Crimson's offense was so slow and boring. His moveset was deemed as repetitive and the fans were asleep. Crimson's body was so long he looked like a tube of toothpaste that had been squeezed. His ginger hair was receding but gelled up, which is never a good look. But despite this, he still kind of had the look of a main eventer somehow. Unfortunately, he didn't have much more than that. As far as mic skills went, there weren't any. He could string sentences together, but it was normally just the most basic of stuff. He didn't even have a catchphrase. Even I have a catchphrase. It was around this point that they started to acknowledge that Crimson had never been pinned or submitted. He entered the Bound for Glory series and was doing pretty good, but then it all went wrong. Samoa Joe was also in the tournament, but was being booked to have a losing streak. Yeah, that'll get him over. Joe previously had his own undefeated streak in TNA, and he was jealous of the success that Crimson was having. Joe was normally busy straining on the toilet, but he managed to find a spare moment to take out Crimson, and because of the attack, Crimson was forced out of the tournament. At this point he had wins over Bobby Roode, Kurt Angle, RVD, Bully Ray, and he had beaten Samoa Joe multiple times. He carried on getting the better of Samoa Joe, and because he was a bad loser, he tried to take out Crimson's ankle again, before he was run off by Matt Boring, and this opened up the next chapter of Crimson's TNA career. Matt Boring and Crimson looked more like brothers than Crimson and Amazing Red ever did. They were both tall, lanky, and had short hair, and lacked a connection with the fans. The best thing about Crimson around this time was probably his entrance music. That isn't to say I was totally down on the guy. I did like him. There just wasn't that much to say about him. As far as his in-ring work went, he was pretty green. He had 4 main moves that you would see in every single Crimson match. The cravat with knees followed by a net breaker, the red alert, the red sky, and of course, what Goldberg retread would be complete without a dodgy looking spear. Anyway, he started feuding with Matt Morgan. They had what you would call a friendly rivalry. They were pretty much even in matches, but they had some strange brawls that looked really fake. They just kept punching each other back and forth, with neither of them selling. The match at Turning Point was thrown out because they wouldn't stop hitting each other. So now we had 2 big guys with neither of them able to beat the other. So what did TNA do? Oh, let's team them up because they enjoy punching each other. The next week they won the tag belts together as the 2 big men who could never get over were now a team. They held the belts for 4 months without anything interesting happened. They then feuded with Magnus and Samoa Joe, the latter who he had a lot of history with. They dropped the belts and in a surprising twist, Crimson turned on Matt Morgan. Yes, you heard that right. A partner that Matt Morgan did not turn on. It was not his fault. So when I say people can't trust Morgan, Crimson is apparently the exception. Crimson was now a heel, but his promos came across as whiny and lacking energy.
Started cluttering my life? Started cluttering my future? Ain't happening. I did the same thing I do with my trash. Took it out.
He beat Morgan at Lockdown 2012 in a cage, and that was pretty much the end of that. They had nothing for him. He had this huge winning streak, but still nobody cared, and he had no direction. At Slammiversary, the plug was finally pulled on the street. He was given a mystery opponent. The old cowboy James Storm was making a return, and he beat Crimson in about 2 minutes. So just like that, his massive streak is over, and no one benefits from it. I have to wonder what the long-term planning here was. Was he supposed to run at the World Champion eventually? They went for all that time and achieved nothing with this. Someone please smack me one and tell me, what was the point? I know people are going to ask for some details about his undefeated streak, so here are the facts. It lasted 470 days, including house shows and Explosion. He was undefeated for 94 matches. For comparison, Goldberg in WCW streak lasted around 546 days with about 162 wins. So they did honestly try with Crimson's streak, but he was just lacking the charisma of a Bill Goldberg, and he just didn't look as nuts. Following the loss, he was only ever seen one more time on TNA TV, losing to Devon Dudley before TNA released him at the start of 2013 as part of cost-cutting measures. He did return in 2015, but not much came of that. He had another return in 2017, and that was a bit different. He was now called Mayweather and had a gimmick playing on his old army past. He also had a tag partner with him called Wilcox, and they were known as the Veterans of War. On his return, his previous TNA run as Crimson was not mentioned, despite it being only 2 years ago. Their gimmick seemed to be clicking with the fans and it was going okay. They were just 2 big powerhouse ass kickers. Then TNA released them after about 5 matches. Well, that was a waste of time. So ultimately, the Crimson experiment failed and TNA were unable to make their own Bill Goldberg. I will at least say that they gave him some decent wins, TV time, and they surrounded him by a lot of experienced heads. He just wasn't the guy, and TNA eventually realised this. The undefeated streak probably did the guy more harm than good, as he hadn't been given the time to learn the trade and work his way up the card like another wrestler would. He might have connected with the fans more, but instead it felt like Crimson was being forced down our throats, and the fans rejected him. Does Crimson deserve the hate he gets on here? Nah, there wasn't really anything that offensive here. He didn't live up to the hype and the build he got, but it was only for around a year and a half, and the matches were mostly pretty quick, and the guy was more likeable than several of the other big men TNA tried to push in the past. And if you don't agree with that, I'll kick your ass.